Welcome back to Plato's Cave. I'm with Paul Russell. He is a professor of philosophy at Lund University, where he is also the director of the Lund-Gothenburg Responsibility Project. Paul is also a professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia, and today he's been gracious enough to join me to talk about his 2008 paper, which I recently read and found very interesting, Free Will, Art, and Morality. And Paul was also kind enough to send me a current draft of a chapter for the Oxford Handbook of Moral Responsibility that he's working on. So Paul, thanks very much for doing this.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Sure. Yeah. Hey, can I ask really quickly, I was just curious because, so I just read your bio, and are one of those universities kind of like your home university and the other is a more secondary position?
It's kind of without boring you or everybody else, the short version of this, I taught at UBC since 1987. And then in 2015, I got this chance for a half-time research position in Sweden, which was originally based in Gothenburg. But a couple of years on, we decided that Lund would be a good base. So now we're in both Gothenburg and Lund, but I moved down to Lund. And so I'm half-time there, and now actually I'm more or less retired from UBC, sad to say. Of course, I'm in denial about my age like everybody else, but that's where I'm at. So I was at half-time basically at UBC for the last 5 or 6 years. But now I'm more or less retired.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was browsing a little bit about the Gothenburg Responsibility Project, and it seems very cool. I mean, it seems like you're doing active research into responsibility and its connections with law, especially, right?
Right. So it's got that. It's got what we've done is, I would say, we've not gone heavily into the applied ethics end of things, although you can go that way. I have some colleagues in Gothenburg who are more heavily oriented towards responsibility, medical ethics, business ethics, that kind of stuff. But mostly we are into kind of normative ethics, moral psychology, as you say, responsibility in the law, action theory, that kind of range of stuff. So we've tried to give it a little bit of identity so that it has a kind of focus that way, and it's not just a kind of no brand kind of thing, but it's got some kind of identity. It's nice.
Yeah, it looks like a very interesting project. How long has that been going on?
So that started in 2015. I should, give a thank you, a public thank you, if I can, to the Swedish taxpayers, basically, because they fund it pretty massively. So it started in 2015. We're incredibly lucky. It's a 10-year project, and so we've got a cluster now of PhDs. That's the kind of core. We've got 6-7 PhDs. And I have some other colleagues Gunnar Björnsson was the person in Sweden who was connected with it. He's at Stockholm. Andras Zagetti is my associate director. He's at Linköping, but also coming down to Lund now. And Matt Talbert, who you may well know his work, who's been at West Virginia and has been connected with the project for several years now as well. So those are the sort of senior people. And then, of course, we've got people at Lund as well, the very good people in practical philosophy, Jörg Pettersson, people of that sort. Vladimir Rabinovich.
Yeah, nice.
Nice cluster.
Yeah, a great clustering of people. So yeah, I want to get into the paper, but it struck me, I actually don't know how long have you been working in responsibility topics, and what actually made you kind of get into that area in the first place?
Well, you just shared your age with me, and it shocked me and mortified me. I go back. I didn't know Plato. I'm interested in Hume, but I didn't even know him. So actually, really, this started, I would say, my major interest, actually, in the early 80s when I started as a PhD student in Cambridge, in the UK. And actually, my early interest was in the philosophy of history and freedom and responsibility. And actually, way back when, it was in the Marxist theory of history and problems of freedom relating to that. And then, so I was working with people like Jerry Cohen, G.A. Cohen, if you know his work. But then I sort of moved through my interest in Hume and responsibility. So that's I would say now this is my fifth decade I'm heading into.
Wow, that's
Doesn't
awesome.
sound good. I
Yeah.
don't know if there'll be six. I'll be lucky.
Well, it sounds good from the perspective of, you probably know what you're talking about if you're in your fifth decade at this point.
I like the cautious probable.
Yeah. Well, there's
should might be another way of putting it.
Sure, should and probably.
Yeah.
Um,
Hopefully.
yeah,
We'll find out.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, you certainly know more than I do. That being said, I did I liked your paper a lot. It's very, I think, I'll post it as I do all the papers for people I talk with. But I think it's very accessible. I mean, there's, as any, academic paper, there's some terminology and stuff, but it's a very nice paper, and it has a kind of a neat, it's the central move to the paper, I think, can be understood by most people. And the way I understand the central move, and you can correct me if I misunderstand it, is that, basically you point out that, look, in these very common domains, athletics or art or musical ability, things like that, we make value judgments all the time about people's abilities. We say, person X is a good artist, someone is a clutch soccer player, something like that. Yeah. And we never kind of have to go into questions of determinism to make those judgments. Right. And then you simply ask the question, well, why think that we have to do that for responsibility judgments or responsibility evaluations? And the answer that you end up, answering your own question with is no, we don't have to. So that seems all correct to you?
That's exactly right. That's the basic idea, Jordan. And it's, it's an odd thing, as you say, because some of these academic areas like the free will problem become more and more kind of introverted, and people start taking for granted what the problems are and what they aren't. And you're quite right. Something that struck me, this was actually, the prompt there, as you may have noticed, was Robert Kane's really interesting book on the significance of free will, where he takes a strong libertarian incompatibilist line. And one of the things I found really stimulating was his effort to actually say we care about free will for reasons that really go beyond just responsibility issues. We care about being an individual. We care about being creative. We care about making achievements and contributions. And that just struck me as kind of, if you want, existentially or phenomenologically just true. So it's a funny thing, as you know, about the free will issue. It's a bit like God and the soul. It's one of these issues that resonates. It's not just a theoretical problem, like, what's the causal relation? People might be interested in that, but they don't get too excited on the whole about it. But with free will, that's different, because I think it relates to people's sense of themselves. Yeah. And the value of being a human being and what it involves. So that's how I kind of got into it, as you say, with this concern about the relationship between freedom and morality, and on the other hand, freedom and things beyond morality like art, and even then down to the more mundane stuff like sports and whatnot, and just ordinary professional achievements where, as you say, we evaluate each other and our activities all the time, but don't seem so worried about free will.
Yeah, and I think you make some sort of a remark about this in the unpublished proof that you sent me. This is like a topic that is at the core of not only our conceptions of ourselves, but our interactions with others too. So it's not like these other questions in philosophy, like, is knowledge a justified true belief or not? Like that, not a lot, you could argue, in practicality hinges on your answer to that, right? But these questions are not like that at all. And that's something that makes me just like super, I've just gotten engrossed in this topic, since taking a class that kind of touched on it. It's my senior year, and I love this topic so much because of that.
It sort of engages at that much deeper level. And it does, of course, as you say, I mean, you mentioned the connection between these issues and law. So one of the things a lot of people really feel is, we have a whole legal system built on top of our moral assumptions, and our moral assumptions are really based in terms of on top of our metaphysical self-conception that we're responsible free agents.
Yes.
So yeah, it has big practical payoff.
Yeah. So you mentioned the remarks about that Robert Kane has made on this. And that was one thing I wanted to kind of ask you about because in the paper you kind of set up one of your main targets is the libertarian. This person who believes that we have some sort of contra causal free will. We can kind of will things to be otherwise, even if the preconditions were the same in, world A and world B, for instance. I, this is something I've had my views on a lot of these questions really battered around just talking with different people and reading different papers and everything. And this is one question that I've actually had an entire 180 on. And I'm curious what you think about this because it strikes me that and you kind of do touch this in the paper, but I used to kind of say that a kind of very incompatibilist line that like, oh, free will makes no sense because determinism is true. And I read this paper recently by Susan Wolf, her first published paper in 1980, Asymmetrical Freedom. And she made this crazy incisive point that I had totally missed, where she says, okay, well, look, like to the incompatibilist who says that, they make that conditional claim. Don't you realize that then you're hinging the condition of being responsible on indeterminism, right? So if you're saying determinism rules out moral responsibility or free will, the converse would have to be true, or the contrapositive. And then she points out that those conditions make no sense really, because in a world, and I'm curious what you think about this, because she totally persuaded me that a world in which we do have libertarian freedom is a world in which I think responsibility might even make less sense than a determined world, because your actions would just be almost not connected to you would be able to act as though your current action or your current state of mind would have no connection to who you were in the past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. It just strikes me as extremely almost incoherent, and I'm curious your thoughts on that.
So this Jordan, as I'm sure you know, is the old dilemma of determinism all the way back. And the worry is that if determinism, as you say, if determinism and necessity poses a problem, worries about the agent couldn't have done otherwise, the agent was fated, all these kinds of what Daniel Dennett calls bugbears and bogeymen on that yeah. horn of necessity or determinism. But as you say, then if you in Wolf's style, but it's a fundamental point, if you want to deny that and you want to say there's an incompatibility there, then the worry is, so how is indeterminism going to help? Enhance freedom, give you the kind of freedom you need for responsibility. And then it becomes very difficult for the libertarian to say something about that. And actually that does relate a little bit to Keynes' work, just since I was referencing him, because he is a libertarian and an incompatibilist, is acutely aware of that. And I don't know if you know his work, but he tries to, as it were, rescue libertarianism from panicky metaphysics. That's P.F. Strawson's term. Yeah. And kind of metaphysical extravagance, and tries to give it a more naturalistic account. But it's an interesting question. Myself, as much as I admire Keynes' work, I don't think this succeeds either, for just the reason you're suggesting. There's still this worry about the kind of luckiness. It's a famous luck objection that applies to libertarianism. And of course, then you're into, this is a familiar territory for fundamental philosophical problems. If you can't live on the horn of necessity, and you can't live on the horn of necessity and determinism, you can't live on the horn of indeterminism and chance, then it looks like skepticism falls. But then you get, from my point of view, then you get into the implausible conclusion that you have to somehow live your skepticism. And I think I'm skeptical about that. So yes. Now we're in a real mess.
Yeah.
That's where we've been at for a long time.
Yeah, you do a good job in the paper of kind of showing just how messy the current debate is, because it does seem like no one really has a great answer, and you sort of try to forge your own path out of the wilderness there. Yeah.
So I think for what that's exactly right. During my own work is to try and suggest that when you're in that position for a long time philosophically, then you have to start asking yourself if there's something wrong with the question and the conception of solutions that you're looking for.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that, but before we get there, I just wanted to kind of maybe for people who haven't read the paper or who haven't read it as closely, you kind of, you go through these three axes of kind of like ways that we evaluate people in these, and you start out with these very what should be easy to agree to areas like aesthetics or sports. And so the axes are ability, opportunity, and effort. That's one. And then the second is performance and achievement. And the third is assessment and evaluation. And
Right.
so maybe if you could just say a little bit about those three.
Right. So this really goes back to your original point about the morality art relationship. So I was thinking, this is part of my point of entry into this paper, was to say that there's something that's seemingly completely unique about the morality situation. So if you take art as an obvious case where we care about being agents, care about being individuals, care about freedom in some sense to manifest our individuality. As you say, we've got it. I mean, philosophy, for those of us who are philosophers, you can use that as an example itself, which is there's a question, it takes some measure of intelligence to get into a philosophy problem and certainly to say something interesting about it. So there's got to be some ability there. And that, as we all know, depends a lot on what your opportunities are for education and exposure. I mean, your own track record as an undergraduate, finding philosophy as you go along is just a case of this. There's a certain degree, if you want, of luck even about that.
Yeah, a huge degree.
A huge degree for so many people. Who are you exposed to? What institution do you go to? And what chances do you have and opportunities do you have?
Yeah.
And then of course there's another element, which is the effort element, which seems it's kind of an interesting one, that one, because it seems a little bit more coming from within rather than vulnerable to what nature, the natural lottery gives you or what social conditions give you, but something you find within, although we can talk more about that, but even that is problematic.
Yes.
When you start reflecting enough. And then, as you say, that's your kind of, I would put it this way, that's your platform. So you can think about art like that. The example is, I give is Mozart. So Mozart's born with this enormous talent, lucky him. He's born with a parent, his father was able to teach him, and so on and so forth. And of course, he had the discipline to make something of all that. And then you get into the performance and achievement aspect, where he achieved so much and he had such massive contributions and significance and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there's the evaluative aspect. The third aspect is we have normative standards about what these practices are, whether it's music or philosophy or morality. And they all seem to have this, as you say, core. This is the core analogy. They all have this kind of structure, and we have standards of response. What's an appropriate way of evaluating people? What seems like fair evaluation? What's unfair? That in the case of morality, it looks like excuses and exemptions operate here. So there's that deep structural, as you say, that on this analysis that I give, there's that kind of seemingly deep structural parallel. And then the question is, what's the significance of that for morality once you start seeing that?
Yeah. And just a clarifying question. So when you say, because I think I totally agree with this if I read you correctly. So when you say, there's the, and these are very sort of local or pragmatic distinctions you're making, there's the ability that you're born with, and that's obviously luck. I'm not going to be lucky enough to be a pro basketball player because I was born with the height of 5'10". Like, it's just not going to happen, Yeah. And so there's an obvious kind of local sense in which there's only luck involved there. I mean, I guess you could be malnourished growing up and be even shorter or something, something like that. But again, that might be luck too. But then I take it that you're not making a metaphysical distinction. It's more of a pragmatic distinction between that and then sort of the effort that you put into that. So Kane would be making a metaphysical distinction there by saying that you have this sort of contracausal effort or your will. And you, if I understand you, aren't going out on the limb that far. You're just saying, look, like there's this very real kind of, if you don't ask too many questions about it, there's this obvious and clear distinction between your presets and then what you do with those, almost, right?
Yes. Well, this does go, it goes beyond just free will. This goes very deep into our social conditions and our, if you want, our ideological conception. And as an American, I think, because I think of America as a little bit the home of this ideology, if I could put it this way, although it's not unique to America, it has origins that go far beyond that. But there is this idea of the self-made person. So, that this is kind of fundamental. If I was to put it in a kind of political context, you might say that in the capitalist ideology, there's the idea that there's opportunity for everyone. And if you want to make it, it's up to you. So it's just, you can package it in 100 different ways, but God's given everyone this opportunity to make something of themselves. And if things don't work out, it's your problem, not bad luck. So there's this kind of aspiration for, the way I would put it is, it's a huge optimism about the human condition, which in some ways is quite admirable. But that's the effort component, which is we can make ourselves, we can be self-creators, and we can find there's always a path ahead for us, and we're not just victims of fate. And that, of course, is an admirable disposition in many ways, except when it becomes completely untruthful about what's actually happening in society and to individuals and even to ourselves.
Yeah. When it becomes, don't you know, poor people just don't work hard. That's when it becomes, exactly.
So it has that counterpart. And I think there's a responsibility, so if you end up in the prison system, that's because you've made bad choices and it's all about you. But a lot of reflection, this is the complicated part, is I don't want to be a skeptic about that, but I also want to think as part of this effort notion, you could have made a moral effort. Lots of people have bad conditions and bad social environments, bad upbringing, and that's the effort compartment. So if you want their opportunities seem damaged, to take that first platform that we were talking about, the notion of opportunity and ability. So the kind of assumption there is that effort sort of moralizes that situation such that the freedom you have as an individual is to always to overcome whatever the contingencies are that are thrown your way. So when it comes to performance and achievement, you can always do it if you make the right kind of effort. I'm always amazed, you see successful sports athletes sitting there with their Olympic medals saying, I just want to say to all you kids back at home, just keep trying because anybody can make it. And I'm thinking, that's a nice message in a way.
But no, like no one really, not everyone can. No.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, okay. So if I'm understanding you correctly, we can talk totally consistently about effort without that doesn't tie you to being a libertarian, and it doesn't weaken the sense of effort either.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's an important point, Jordan. That's exactly right from my point of view, because there's a metaphysical notion of effort, which sort of, and this goes, if you know Kant's philosophy, there's this notion of a kind of transcendent rational will that allows you to step outside of everything that's true about your contingent circumstances and find some kind of motivation that transcends all of that. But as you say, you don't have to go that way. You can still, if you want, within compatibilist terms, emphasize the importance of effort and the significance of it. But the worry then is, where does the effort come from? And there's going to be a background. This is the more skeptical move from some points of view. The skeptical worry or the threat to that is that even when people, if you're the kind of person who's resilient enough to make an effort, there's probably some explanation for why you're like that.
Yeah. I don't have any control over the limits of my own effort in some sense. I mean, you can't will more willpower. Like, it just, at some point it ends.
It becomes a kind of vicious regress. And then you get into weird libertarian metaphysics, because in order to stop that regress, you've got to start introducing something a little spooky, like the pure self, the rational self, or the noumenal self, or something like that.
Yeah, it's always interesting, it's a little bit of a, it's a tongue-in-cheek kind of response to a libertarian, but it's like, well, if you really do have that libertarian free will, why aren't you just the perfect person? Why don't you have, 10% body fat, and why haven't you published and all that? Because if you can just will more willpower, why stop?
Failure. Well, because I guess you're a bad person. If it's not
Yeah,
happening, that's
yeah,
their answer.
yeah. Yeah, it just collapses into like a puritanical view at that
It's
point.
your fault. If they're right,
Yeah,
it's your fault.
that it's your fault
Yeah.
all the way down. Yeah, if they're
All
right.
actually,
Yeah.
that's yes, as you say, all the way down, and that's a really important qualification. In
Hmm.
fact,
Yeah, yeah.
um,
So okay, with that understanding, which I'm happy to have gotten from you, because then I do fully agree. Because I didn't think that you were kind of trespassing into spookier metaphysics, but I wanted to confirm.
yeah,
So okay, so that seems, so I totally buy that then, that we do always make these distinctions, and we never ask about determinism, or at least, we rarely do. Maybe we do or not, I will have to see. But you say, that when we're considering those kind of standards of evaluation, that there are natural kind of fairness questions that arise, and you list them in the paper. They are: is the standard of evaluation the right or correct standard? Has this standard been properly applied to the agent and or the performance? And then, are the conditions and circumstances of evaluation and assessment fair and reasonable?
right.
And I was actually, the funny thing is I was kind of thinking, I was trying to find examples of this in my own life, and like applying to the philosophy programs kind of came up. And they're, in evaluating me, I mean, they're going to be asking these questions, does he fit the standards and qualifications that we're looking for in an applicant? And determinism, I mean, you're right, it just doesn't come into it. I mean, they are trying to get a glean of my academic abilities and character and who I'm going to be in the program, and all these things. And you never have to kind of regress into determinism to answer those. And so that point does just seem empirically right to me.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
this comes up with the art example as well, which is, it's interesting because we might, as educators, say, be interested in figuring out what makes it possible for a student to succeed, and what kind of barriers operate that make them fail.
Hmm.
So there is a sense in which, although it may not be put in terms of free will and determinism, there's, I wouldn't want to exaggerate the sense in which we're just, from an ordinary point of view, unreflective about background conditions. Because you might worry, as you say, about, just to take something as simple as an application to a graduate program. I know when I look at it, I think, so some students, as it were, you think about them in terms of the potential or the obstacles they've had to overcome. Those seem like legitimate considerations to me.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit reluctant to just think about them cold in terms of what's the essay like, what's the
Who are they
essay,
in this moment? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Just kind of what's their grade point average. That may not tell me a lot of things that seem relevant. And in that sense, you might start leading into issues about background conditions. And as you know, the issues about diversity and equity now
Mm-hmm.
carry a lot of baggage that seems to me not unrelated or unconnected with worries about social justice in relation to people having real opportunities and their abilities and potentials being properly recognized.
Mm.
So there are kind of this sense that the free will problem is funny, because in some sense it gets hyper abstract, but in another sense it bleeds almost subconsciously into a lot of very deep social issues, some of which we're dealing with,
Yeah.
for better or worse, in various ways right now.
I was, that thought had kind of crossed my mind too, and I almost wonder, it's a little bit confounded, the whole point about, have you overcome anything, in order to kind of, get where you are, apply to this program. I could imagine two responses to that. I could imagine one saying, well, all that question is really kind of trying to dig at other present tense character traits that they might have, right? So if you know that one applicant really overcame a lot of struggles, they might be more resilient, and that is kind of a present and forward looking trait.
Right.
Or you could have what might be kind of the more hard and compatibilist responses, like, oh, okay, this explains some deficit in their application, right? I was only a philosophy minor because my high school didn't have a lot of didn't yeah. So there's this weird kind of confounding dichotomy there.
There is, and the other side of that. So, as it were, it can cut it, as you say, it can cut in two directions. One direction is to make you much more sensitive to the things that have been obstacles and limits, where someone's potential may not be properly realized, and that could be true in ethical life, artistic life, sports life, you name it. We're kind of sensitive to that. But the flip side, isn't it true as well, Jordan? And this is the side that actually I want to emphasize from a kind of more compatibilist friendly point of view, which is you don't want to read that become so sensitive to those kinds of issues, if you want those issues about luck and history and fate, of those kinds of concerns, to start denying that there are real differences between people. Because if, just to use the example I give, if you've got Mozart, you might well think, gosh, lucky person. Just won the artistic lottery in terms of natural talent, best circumstances, best training, so on and so forth. But it's still true, he's a fantastic, gifted person, where some people want to say, oh, there's no real merit there unless somehow it was all coming from him without any of these contingencies. But that seems crazy. And then more negatively on the converse side, as happens in education, there are people who you have to just say, well, there may be a lot of reasons why this person is never going to be a very good musician, philosopher, football player, or whatever, but they're just no good. And so we don't want them in our program, or we don't want them in our team, or we don't want them in our community if they're morally damaged. So that's the flip side, which is the skeptic seems to me in danger of wanting to sort of deny the reality and the importance of those distinctions.
Yeah. You know, this is sort of one of the most, I guess, perhaps my most skeptical question about this paper, because I think I really, really like it, but I'm wondering about, there might be some small points where I might diverge from what you argue. And I'm wondering if this is one of them. So I wonder if there's a really kind of more sharp distinction than the paper makes between something like evaluation and then something like desert attitudes, right? So I wouldn't, it's funny, if I hand this paper to someone and I say, read this with respect to desert judgments, I kind of want to distance myself from the paper. But if I hand them the paper and say, read this with respect to moral evaluations and maybe kind of reactive attitudes, then I love the paper. And so please, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that's true. It's a good point. And I think, so for example, someone who comes to mind is colleague Dirk Pereboom's work. If you know Dirk's hardened compatibilist, he's this kind of a skeptic of a sort, but as you say, the more nuanced position that he would take up would be something like, well, of course, I recognize that there are these distinctions to be drawn, but what really disappears here once you become sensitive to these background conditions influencing the way agents are and why they are the way they are, whether in morality or whatever, it's what seems to evaporate, as you say, is desert. But desert does a lot of work here. So I'm sympathetic to this, but in a qualified way, which is, I think there are conceptions of desert that are metaphysically loaded and that run quite deep in our society in terms of our self-conception, that actually involve this notion that we are fundamentally self-creators or originators of our character, certainly in ethics, of our character, conduct, and motivation, that there's some power of that. And that notion of desert, as it were, sits on top of that kind of metaphysical self-conception, and it's normatively very demanding, if I can put it that way. Dirk, and I share this with Dirk and other skeptics of that sort, Dirk Pereboom is skeptical about that, and therefore thinks that kind of desert, that notion of desert, what he calls basic desert, evaporates. That sounds a little bit like what you're thinking as well, if I've got you right, Jordan.
Yeah, I think so.
But here's the way in which I think I diverge from this, which is what I'm skeptical about is that any credible notion of desert has to be, as it were, metaphysically loaded in that way. I still think that there's something that's left, which is, as it were, it's not just a matter that you can make distinctions, but we still, as it were, see people. I might understand whether it's myself or other people as really having all kinds of contingencies of luck that shape the kind of character I am. But fundamentally for me, this is my compatibilist side. I have powers of moral capacities and moral powers, of self-understanding, self-interpretation, self-reflection that make it not just that I have these kinds of, I'm stuck with these kinds of evaluative commitments I've got, but that I'm someone who is able to engage in a much more sophisticated way. And there's, from my point of view, a robust notion of desert that survives. That's in the moral context. Mm. And then just by way of this paper that we're talking about, with the artistic analogy would be similar, which is, of course, there are people who have been fortunate or unfortunate in relation to their artistic or intellectual powers and abilities. But I don't think it means that the desert evaporates there. You still got people who are high achievers and understand what they're doing and are inside that practice, if I can put it that way, slightly Wittgensteinian. And that's a robust notion of desert, so that you can really say that philosophy student is a really interesting student. Yeah, they had privilege of all sorts, maybe, but they're really interesting and able and sharp. I don't see in those cases, contrary to the skeptical move, that desert evaporates in those circumstances.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think I would sign on the dotted line there if we weren't. That's interesting. I almost feel that way. That certainly applies to something like reactive attitudes, like for listeners, something like blame, resentment, indignation to be the negative, or gratitude, love on the positive side, right? Yeah. There seems to me to be this kind of. I wonder if there's not more of a sharp distinction than is the case in some of the literature between those attitudes and then desert practices, almost, right? So I wonder if what you're saying, because what you're saying just lands for me completely with respect to those attitudes, but then when we move into practices, I mean, my current position, because it's going to get pushed around by some paper at some point, is that I don't know how desert practices of sort of revenge or retribution, or in the lay terms, like getting even with someone in a fundamental sense, right? Those don't seem to hold for me, whether or not determinism is true. Yeah.
I'm totally sympathetic. I hope it don't sound like I'm just co-opting your position here, but I am actually really sympathetic to this. And I think I'm on side, because my worry, in fact, is that there's in this area, there's a tendency, just as you suggest, Jordan, to collapse issues of responsibility and retribution. So I'm much more skeptical about our retributive practices.
Okay.
And how they're connected to our reactive attitudes. So one worry I have about some people who want to, as it were, vindicate the reactive attitudes is they see this as sort of moving straight into, as it were, vindication of retributive practices. And I think, in fact, those two issues are quite separate. So our reactive attitudes might be quite well justified, but we have quite different set of issues about, okay, so our reactive attitudes are justified, but are retributive practices based on those justified? Are they effective? Are they constructive? We have different set of issues there. From my point of view, more utilitarian oriented, less backward oriented, less desert oriented.
Okay.
So there's a lot to say about that, but I think some skeptics, for what it's worth, are actually, in a way that I'm sympathetic to, they're motivated by their skepticism about retribution. My objection to them is that they present that as skepticism about responsibility.
Okay.
Those two are separate.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and I think you're right that those two issues are definitely, to some degree, conflated in some literature. Yeah. I think you're right. That's so interesting. I mean, I was reading. I recently read Wolff's 81 paper, The Importance of Free Will, and then, because I know you cited in one of the papers, Summers' 2007 rejection of that, that kind of view. Yeah. And it's so interesting, because it seems like I just buy Wolff's point, and I know Tamler Summers, disavows that paper currently.
He's now a double reversed.
Yeah. He's full Strassonian at this point. it seems totally correct that we both can't and shouldn't jettison reactive attitudes, because Wolf and Strawson are just totally right. I mean, that is what constitutes interpersonal life. I mean, we're not that close, but if I were treating you as something to be managed, some object to be manipulated, that does, I mean, that just vitiates interpersonal and moral life completely. And I think that is like the core of why um reactive attitudes survive happily with the truth of determinism. um and it's funny because, yeah, what you were saying made me kind of think about, I've recently changed my mind again about the basis of retributivist punishment, where I thought previously, it doesn't make any sense because determinism is true, and now I think it makes no sense whether or not determinism is true, um precisely for those kind of consequentialist reasonings. Yeah, so it's I'm glad that you make the distinction. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the point you're making about the relationship between personal life and reactive attitudes, or skepticism about reactive attitudes, this is a big area of debate right now, and really coming out of P.F. Strawson's Freedom and Resentment, because Strawson famously argued that if we get rid of as you were saying, if we get rid of the reactive attitudes, we're left with this kind of objective stance where we're stripped of our interpersonal relations, and it seems kind of dystopian and horrific.
Yeah.
And there's certainly been, as I'm sure you know, efforts by various people. Paraboom is one very important person. R.J. Wallace is another, to kind of separate and say, look, the moral reactive attitudes, we could maybe get rid of them and still retain a lot of our interpersonal life. And there's a big debate about how much that can or cannot be done. But I share even if that kind of modified proposal to slightly optimistic proposal that we could strip ourselves of our negative, pernicious, reactive attitudes and all our retributive dispositions. I think of this as a kind of Californian move to go very mellow, none of the negativity, feel positive, just think how we can help one another, we can treat people instead of punish people, all this kind of stuff. It's an interesting question, just how dehumanizing that itself is. And that goes to my own, and maybe this is your sensibility here too, Jordan. My sense is that there's something dehumanizing about not treating people who really have sophisticated moral capacities as if they are really just objects of treatment and therapy and moral education. And I feel that this is a debate that's come back again in the 50s. There was B.F. Skinner, if you know his stuff, Walden 2, all this kind of effort to be sort of skeptical about responsibility and freedom and have a more positive therapeutic approach. And it's come back again as you know, in these kind of contemporary skeptical views about responsibility. But I share this kind of worry that although it's humane at one level because it's trying to get rid of these nasty retributive practices, the worry is that it becomes quite dehumanizing and depersonalizing in its actual institutional social form.
Yeah, I have a lot of mixed thoughts about this question. On one hand, I'm very, very sympathetic to a sort of an asymmetry perspective on this, where it seems like there is something obviously true. And I've tried to kind of be a little bit introspective about this, just in kind of reading this literature. And, there's that old kind of aphorism, anger is like a poison. It just destroys the vessel it's in. I butchered it, but it's something like that, right? Yeah. And there's something kind of true about that with respect to certain sentiments like revenge, right? Or this kind of need to get even with someone in some deep sense, right? And those, as we already said, that there are practices that can be disassociated from reactive attitudes, but I even think there are sort of reactive attitudes more based in that sentiment, right? And there is like a very happy jettisoning of those that I don't think is completely irrational, but at the same time, straying too far into that, or having that as sort of a predisposition when encountering people, does seem, to use Wolf's phrase, to make our relationships take on this hollow ring, as she says,
Yeah.
which is, I love that, because it does. I mean, we can still have a certain type of love, we can still have a certain type of friendship, right? But they are degraded in some small sense. Yeah.
Sounds kind of ersatz and phony somehow.
Yeah, and there is this I almost get this like mental image of, there's this like distancing, or this film that's like created between you and another person. When you're managing someone, you're not. I actually just I'm trying to work on this paper. I presented it at a conference recently and got some really good feedback about this. But there's actually a loss to the person's standing, but there's a loss to you as well.
Yeah.
Because you have just put up that film. And the paper I was presenting on is trying to kind of walk this line between acknowledging that is a real it's a real moral cost, but there are some very clear certain circumstances wherein it's still the moral thing to do because of the outcomes of allowing yourself to embody those reactive attitudes. So I think it's a circuitous answer to your question, but it's kind of a clear
I
fine
think
line.
Strawson, the kernel of the kind of psychological and ethical truth that's operating there, and a kind of resistance to going that way, of getting, this ideal of purging ourselves of anger, and because it's all negative and it's destructive. And of course, there's some truth in that, and it's very important to think about anger and how it can, as you said, poison yourself as well as everybody else. But there's something, it can't, from my point of view, for reasons you were alluding to, I don't think it could be the whole truth. And Strawson gets it, I think, the nub of this, which is what we actually care about is, we care about this is P.F. Strawson, as he puts it, the fundamental attitudes and intentions that other people show and manifest towards ourselves and others. And so I think maybe you share this, was there are some circumstances where I think there's something ethically wrong with someone who doesn't get angry about certain kinds of things. So you can use a kind of extreme example, but you take something like the Holocaust. And I think, do I want to just have kind of a sense of, I'm disappointed that the Nazis behaved this way? I wish it hadn't been like this. What they did was wrong, but there's an explanation for why they were the way they were, such that they don't have any kind of fundamental desert. Something strikes me as, from my point of view, my critical point of view, is I think there's something wrong with that response, because what seems to be wrong is it's disengaged from showing a genuine value, because the way we show we value something, like not behaving like this barbaric way towards other human beings, is we have emotional engagement. And that of course motivates us, and it can motivate us in destructive ways. But for, just as you were saying, that makes me my own instinct about this, or if you want, intuition, and I think it can be articulated and defended along these lines, is that the reason we feel uncomfortable about that is it shows a lack of proper valuing of what's going on here. So
yeah, totally. And I wonder if there's I wonder if there's almost some importance to the distance that you take, or that exists rather, between you and that group, or you and that immoral person, right? So if you're right next to someone who's doing something heinous, there is, because it's so linked to action there. Your attitudes, like, are you going to step in, and are you going to be as likely to step in if you're just this kind of cold, no, you just exactly, you just want to get in there and do something about it, right?
You mentioned Tabler, Jordan. You mentioned Tabler Summers, and his double reversal, as it were, his 2007 defense of the objectivity, and then and if I remember, I think this is on his book on relative justice. He talks about, if you know that work, he talks about one of the reasons he abandoned this was he was thinking about his own children, and if someone harmed one of his children, I think for most of us, certainly for parents, or if we have close relatives, you kind of immediately know that. I know that once or twice my own children in this or that way have been, thank goodness, nothing terrible, but if it's, as you say, that intimate relationship, that close relationship, the idea of switching off your reactive attitudes and not being angry with people who are harming them is just seems something, from one point of view, psychologically incredible, but from another point of view, ethically suspect.
Yeah, and I totally buy that, but I wonder if there is this sort of duality of attitudes that can be held. So I don't have any children, but if someone, I was talking about this with my best friend actually, if someone murdered my best friend right in front of me, would I want to kill that person with my own hands? Yes, I would. And yes, I probably would actually do it, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time,
so that's
well, yeah, exactly. Not a good idea. Yeah, exactly.
Disclaimer.
Disclaimer. And I said probably would. That's where that editing ability comes in.
Yeah, right.
But at the same time, I only feel that, and I think it's totally morally permissible to feel that, and maybe even we might want to say obligatory to have that reaction in that moment, right? But at the same time, I think both me removed from that situation can say, well, yes, it's totally understandable and maybe even desirable to want to do that, but the perpetrator would not deserve to have retribution in that sense, in a deep sense, in a desert-based sense.
Yeah, and that.
Yeah.
Well, do you know if I'm not throwing too much other work into this discussion, but I don't know if you know, Gary Watson's got a famous paper on responsibility and the limits of evil.
Is this the 87 paper?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, yeah, I love that paper.
And very influential paper. It's a very, very interesting discussion of Strawson's freedom and resentment, sympathetic but critical. But if you remember this, the centerpiece of that Watson article is the case of Robert Harris, who's this Californian murderer who horribly killed 2 teenage kids, cold-blooded. And one of the things that is interesting in the way Watson describes this case of Harris is Harris isn't in any obvious sense crazy or schizophrenic. He knows what he's doing. He even seems to understand that he's got a sense of right and wrong. He knows that this is evil. But somehow he's just actually, he's so damaged. But the interesting thing is, it sort of comes to the nub of the discussion we're having, which is there's this history that Robert Harris has that explains why he had a horrible background, himself abused. So the way Watson puts this together, he says that Harris is both a victimizer and a victim. And we have this, as Watson describes it, we have this ambivalence where our reactive attitudes seem unstable, because if we think about what he did, we trigger our strong reactive attitudes. But if we think about what happened to him and why he is the way he is, we feel sympathy for him, and he's so morally unfortunate. If this helps in terms of locating my own views about this, my sense is that, as it were, I think there's still you mentioned the notion of desert. Obviously, the history shows that there's not this kind of strong notion of desert in terms of self-creation and ultimacy that some moral views want to retain. But I also think that it's bizarre to turn to someone like Robert Harris and just treat him like he's someone who, okay, you're just damaged. We're going to try and help you now. We're not going to have these strong reactive attitudes. We can understand what we might do, but we're going to just kind of just be therapeutic here, because in some sense that seems to fail to recognize his own kind of moral character and capacities, which are still there. So Harris, to me, isn't like, it's dehumanizing of Harris from a moral point of view, even in our own responses to him, to treat him like he's a dog or a bear or somebody who's completely brain damaged. He's a much more difficult case. So he's still, if you want, to me, even although he's so hard to reach ethically, he's still someone who's ethically, as it were, present to us, and who we have, it's dehumanizing not to recognize that.
Yeah. And I take it you might even be making the point that our treatment of him in that way would be susceptible to the sort of mirror turn back onto ourselves, almost, in a way,
Very much.
Yeah.
And then and of course, there's some sense in which we might look at ourselves and say, thank God. I think actually, to be Watson himself indulges in some of this stuff. Thank God it's not me. I'm fortunate.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then you can play with that a little bit about what that significance of that is, but it sort of ties up with the points you were putting to me earlier about retribution. I'm not so sure that the response to Robert Harris justifies strong forms of retribution, but I do think that there's something wrong if we don't have the appropriate kinds of reactive attitudes that recognize what he did and what he's like, whatever the story might be about his background. So that's the kind of position I want to occupy there, which is not skeptical, but is more kind of what I call pessimistic.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. That's the chapter or section, what, 6, or I think in the Oxford Handbook that you sent me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So okay, this is something else I wanted to ask you, and actually the Watson paper is a perfect way to bring it up. So Watson says, because he does that. It's if people haven't read it, it's a wonderful paper to read. It's so good.
Really good.
He gives us the case of Robert Harris. What should be the most quintessentially evil bastard that ever existed, right? And then he gives us that backstory, and the backstory is almost as horrible as even his, as his deeds. And he has this phrase that it stuck out to me very strongly, because he says, so Watson says, you hear the crime, you have these attitudes, and then you hear the backstory and you think, well, no wonder he did what he did. He has that exact phrase, well, no wonder.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that to my eye, the well, no wonder is a substitute or a surrogate for, well, he was determined in the wrong way. Yeah. And I wonder if determinism begins to creep back into the picture in exactly that sense. Yeah. He was unfortunate to be determined in the wrong way to be part of the moral community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Watson almost slides. He's interesting because he almost slides into a skeptical position. He starts off kind of being very sympathetic to Strawson. Then he describes his case, and basically he's saying, and I think he's right about this, that Strawson is strangely unconcerned about history and luck.
Yeah.
In a way that the Robert Harris case brings out. Mm-hmm. And then it's a little bit like Watson's own position is a bit, to my mind, slightly unstable, which is he describes it as this a sense of ambivalence, but it's almost like he's toying with skepticism, because he's really thinking, if history and luck matter in this way, as you say, the no wonder moment, no wonder Harris is the way he is, then how much can we really retain or remain committed to our reactive attitudes? But that's maybe the point at which I kind of jump off from him, because what I want to say is what I think we find difficult in our kind of dominant self-interpretation of our kind of moral self-image is the idea that we might actually, as it were, be both free and responsible agents, understood in terms of having fairly robust capacities of understanding norms, understanding normative practices, having emotional responses that are related to that, if you want, part of the moral life or moral community. And at the same time, putting these two together, being aware that we are subject to significant forms of fate and luck. And the Robert Harris case, to me, brings that out. But I have a different, I think Watson's position is that he's unhappy with that blending, whereas I want to say that's what's the truth about the human predicament. And just for what it's worth, my views there, just to people who might be listening to this and wanting to think about reading it, my views kind of approach closer to someone like Bernard Williams. If people are interested in his views, that's the kind of branch that I would move towards.
Yeah. If I read correctly, he was involved either your advisor or on your committee when you were in your PhD.
My supervisor.
That's awesome. That's so cool. Yeah.
I was very lucky.
I love his critique of consequentialism. It's and like, as someone who likes to think of himself as a consequentialist, I even like it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's coming from a strong place then.
Yeah. No, it's that good of a paper. Yeah.
But his target, Williams' target here is what he calls morality, which is maybe the really deep source of from my point of view, of the free will problem, which is there's a certain kind of, in my view, compatibilists and libertarians and skeptics tend to all share this deep assumption that, as it were, whatever else is true, we can't have conditions in which agents are free and responsible and subject to fate and luck. Mm. But from the point of view that I would defend, which is, I think, broadly sympathetic to the Williams style view as well, that's how it is in ethical life. And we find that difficult to accept because that is kind of disturbing. So Robert Harris is disturbing to us. And then, as you say, Jordan, that comes back and I realize I myself, you yourself are all part of that predicament.
Yes. Yeah, we're mere versions of Robert Harris. Yeah.
In that very general sense. Hopefully not in the specifics.
No. That is not an admission of guilt of anything. I wonder, I've been kind of, I don't, this isn't really a fully developed thought, but I'm wondering if there's almost this kind of weird, uncanny valley of reactive attitudes and evil or something like that, right? Where, when people in our lives are people with whom we are easily well adjusted and we just have happy relationships with them, right? These questions never arise because they almost don't need to, right? And then, a friend betrays you in a minor way and these natural reactive attitudes come up and you want to deal with resolving that conflict in a non-calculated way, right? But if you walk the evil kind of far enough, there's this weird uncanny valley of it where people do begin to almost look like the Robert Harris case of I wonder if we switch from reactive attitudes of blame, indignation, anger, resentment to what went wrong almost, or this sort of, them being determined in the wrong ways in some way. I don't know. I've been toying with that idea.
Well, I think this is quite important because I think in some sense the Robert Harris case or the Holocaust case, these very dramatic cases of kind of extreme evil or horrifying evil, in some sense can conceal the much more mundane, ordinary truth about our ordinary everyday moral life. And I rather share this in terms of introspectively making clear what's actually going on in our experience of ethical life. So as you say, with family and with friends, hopefully your relations are normally good and congenial and it's not pressed upon us to start reflecting on how did things go wrong or what's the problem here. But in fact, I think we all find in everyday moral life that you often step back both in relation to other people and say this kind of no wonder moment that you were talking about with Watson. You can sort of say, this person I find really difficult and what they've done is really problematic or even objectionable. And maybe you're triggering strong and justified reactive attitudes. But at the same time, most of us can look and say, I can see how that person got into this situation. Mm-hmm. They're dealing with this, that, or the other, or they have this, that, or the other problem. But does that mean that they're not really responsible, that they don't really know what they're doing? No. That's the move that I can't follow it there, or that if they're not basic desert responsible or fundamentally self-origination responsible, then nothing really substantial is left. That's what I'm skeptical about.
It is. I always am drawn back to kind of looking at this from the libertarian perspective because, I wonder if kind of, what's interesting is I was wondering if your project, I haven't spoken with Manuel Vargas from UC San Diego, but I was emailing with him a little bit. He was too busy to come on the show. But he kind of has this like revisionist view of free will and moral responsibility, where he says, just like people used to think as water as one of the four fundamental elements, we didn't, as we understood more and more about the universe, we didn't create some new element and call it water asterisk or whatever. We just changed the definition of water. And he kind of has that similar perspective on something like free will, as we understand that no, there's really no reason to believe that you're causa sui or that you can step outside the stream of causation in any normal sense. We shouldn't invent some new word about it. We should just refine the conception of free will. And I don't think that you have to endorse that paper, but there's a little bit of flirting with it in the 2008 paper, because you say, we just don't ask about those sorts of questions when we're making these judgments, right? And I wonder, I mean, this is more a question for Vargas than you, but I wonder if both of you might be, and you to a lesser extent, are committed to this project of almost of disavowing people of these kind of lay conceptions of dualist libertarian free will, if you want to have that kind of revisionist project. I don't know, because no one thinks about water in that way anymore, and I wonder if you have to do that with those conceptions of free will.
What's the kind of true essence of responsibility? It's like looking for the true Platonic conceptual truth of what is responsibility really.
Yeah.
And maybe I've misunderstood it. It's an interesting question, because actually this does relate to what might be called responsibility pluralism. So the question's a little bit like, how many concepts of responsibility do we have? And how stable is the concept that we, and then we get into the question, who's we here? We moderns, we Westerns, we Platonic Christians, who?
Yeah.
And that becomes a really interesting question. And then related to the notion of revision, you might have multiple ways of revising. And there's always been, all the way back to people like Hobbes and Hume, they've taken the view, which is that our ordinary concept may have built into it all kinds of illusions or fraudulent misunderstandings. So there's kind of, as you say, Jordan, is this kind of revisionist tradition that comes well into kind of merges with the compatibilist tradition all the way back. But on top of the question of revising and what our ordinary view is or isn't, and whether or not there's a stable, clear account of that to be given, there's also the question of whether or not we just have one correct concept or not. And people like Williams, for example, challenge that. And I don't know if this example helps, but the example that comes to mind along these lines that you mentioned is, it's like the problems of God. So some people think there's only one true conception of God. So if you're a Christian, God is a personal God, an intelligent being, a benevolent being, all these essential attributes. When we're talking about God, there's only one true concept. And either that God exists or it doesn't.
Yeah.
So don't bring in this deist conception that it's something that doesn't have moral attributes. That's not really God. You're just no better than an atheist. So we have something like the same kind of dynamic going on. And the deist is something like a revisionist about our concept of God. But then it's an interesting question of whether there's any coherent concept and how robust that concept might be. And in the case of responsibility, whether or not there's just one correct view. And again, we're getting into more interesting and complicated, difficult stuff, but my own view is kind of pluralistic about, as it were, there's a core fundamental set of features to our concept, but that, as it were, different cultures and different circumstances will articulate and understand and interpret those features in different ways, and there may not be one unique correct way.
Yeah.
Maybe like justice could be seen similarly. It's historically and culturally located, as it were.
Yeah. No, that's interesting, and I mean, I think I buy that. I guess that's maybe a kind of a point where I've always disagreed with someone like Dan Dennett. Like I just spoke with a couple of months back, Greg Caruso, about his new book with Dennett. And Dennett almost seems to almost seems to deny that libertarians exist in a way, or that people have these like lay. I mean, he doesn't do that explicitly, obviously, but he almost seems to be very dismissive of, well, that's not a free will worth wanting. And I actually agree with him about that. But it almost seems like he's saying, well, no one even wants that free will. Whereas I think, no, actually, a lot of people do want that free will. Philosophers, but especially, the non-philosophical. So it's just.
I think there's a strain in compatibilism like that, which is, and Dennett, I sort of share I admire Dennett's work. Obviously, he's a really important, significant contributor to all these topics. But there's slightly a feeling that he's tone deaf
Yeah.
to certain kinds of incompatibilist concerns. And actually, my own work, what I call free will pessimism or critical compatibilism, is actually a response to that. That I feel like maybe like you, I understand what it is that incompatibilists and libertarians think they're aspiring to. And if we can't get that, there's a real loss there. Whereas Dennett wants to say, no, I'm moderately revising our views about, speaking of word of revision, I'm moderately revising our views, not radically, but we've got all the stuff we want. It's all good. Don't worry about it. And don't let these bogeymen and these, what does he calls them, gloom leaders or something?
Yeah. So, yeah.
Dennett style dismissive.
Yeah.
And I find that comes too quickly and too easily to him, and there's more to it there.
Yeah.
I share that attitude.
Yeah. I think the sense of there's more to it is a good place to end on, because I'm realizing that we're well over an hour, closing in an hour and a half, which it flew by for me. And I just want to thank you again for doing this. This is a ton of fun.
Well, I enjoyed it. Thanks so much. There's always a feeling with these, it's open-ended and so interesting. And yeah, I guess what we do is we just show that there's just so much to be said about it. But thanks for your interesting questions and suggestions.
Yeah. On the note of kind of, more to discover, is the so the proof you sent me, that will be published in the coming months, years, with the Oxford Handbook of Moral Responsibility.
Yes, which, like all these handbooks, I edited one on him myself, and they're it's like herding cats.
Yes.
It's a group of philosophers. So Dirk Pereboom and Dan and Elkin have been doing this, and it's taken a little while, but I think it's almost ready to come out.
Okay, great.
So I think it should be out, I think, in early 2022.
Oh, really? Okay, excellent. Yeah. Because I liked this chapter a lot. I mean, I hope to be able to recommend it, because it does, you place a lot of the positions with respect to each other very well. Yeah.
Thanks, Jordan. I really I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And thanks. I'm looking forward to following your other interviews too. They're really interesting people you're putting together quite an interesting series.
If you're still listening, thank you very much for sticking around. I really loved talking to Paul. I mean, we had an awesome conversation. I had totally lost track of time, and I hope that you really enjoyed it as well. Yeah, I think all of this stuff is totally fascinating and important, and it actually, really connects with real life in a lot of ways that some philosophy doesn't obviously appear to. So I will leave links in the description to the paper that I reference from Paul, and to links to his websites and everything like that. And if you want to support this show and keep me kind of focused on what I'm doing here, you can go to patreon.com/Jordan Myers. You can share this show on Twitter or social media. That always helps. You can rate it on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else that allows you to rate a podcast. You can like it on YouTube or subscribe. You can discuss it on your own show, or connect me with guests or recommend topics to cover. And you can get in contact with me at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com, and follow me on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And as always, thank you for listening, and keep struggling to escape the cave.